For those of us who weren't here last week, this term we are considering, what does Jesus want to speak into our world right now? Because we believe that the Bible is just as relevant today as it was when it was written. And so we're going to look at 4 big issues this term. And because they are so important, we're actually going to spend 2 weeks on each of those issues. So last week we started with the issue of racism because of the huge Black Lives Matter protests happening really over the past few years, but especially since George Floyd was killed over 2 months ago now. And we looked at a few verses in the Bible, and for those of you who were here last week, I hope you saw how God created all people in his image, which means that we are all a reflection of who God is, each and every person on this planet. And God's heart is especially concerned for those people that society pushes to the sidelines or even oppresses. And that when one day he restores things back to the beautiful and perfect way he designed them, people from every nation, every tribe, every language, every people will be part of his eternal kingdom. So what are we going to do this week? Well, if we know that God's heart is to lift up those who our society pushes down, then tonight I want to stir our hearts to feel the same way. And then for our words and our actions to follow that. Because if someone encourages you to go out and do something, but your heart's not really in it, then it's going to feel like a chore. But when your heart is in something, then when you want to do something about it, that becomes effortless, even a pleasure. One of the questions I heard asked last week was, where does racism even come from? To me, I think racism comes when we don't know that much about a certain cultural group other than our own. For example, I don't know a single North Korean. But what comes to mind when I think of North Korea? Well, I see one North Korean on the news, and that's Kim Jong-un. And in the news, he seems a bit crazy, but very happy guy. But he's always launching missiles at other countries to threaten them. And all the jokes I hear about Kim Jong-un are all about nukes. So even though I've never met Kim Jong-un, let alone any North Korean person, in my mind, either consciously or unconsciously, I think, well, all North Koreans I know are happy, a little bit crazy, a bit threatening, and they're obsessed with nukes. Now, is that going to be accurate for all North Koreans? I saw a survey where 31% of Australians have negative feelings towards Muslims. And I think it's the same problem. Because when you actually get to know people, you realize that on one hand, all of us have so much in common because we are made in God's image. But on the other hand, we are all unique individuals. So you can't just say all North Koreans are like this or all Aussies are like that. Think of your group of friends. There are things you have in common, and yet you all have your own unique personalities and interests. And it's the same for every other group of people on earth. So if you ever catch yourself thinking that you don't like a certain group of people because they're all like this or like that, ask yourself how many people you really know from that group. And if you don't know anyone, then maybe get to know some before you think something about all of them. And when you hear other people saying things like that, ask them the same question. How many people do they know from that group that they're judging? Now, I mentioned that there are things we think consciously as well as unconsciously. You might not think that you're racist at all, and that is fantastic. But unfortunately, pretty much all of us have unconscious biases. That's biases that we're not even aware that we have. For us, we might get a little bit uncomfortable when a stranger who's from a certain part of the world, when we come across them, But for people in positions of power who make decisions that affect other people, those same biases affect other people's lives when they favor some students over others, or hire some people instead of others, or arrest some people but not others, or maybe even put some people in jail but not others. And they probably don't even realize that they're doing it. And that's why God doesn't just ask us to not be racist. He asks us to give special treatment and attention to the people in our society who are vulnerable, who need it the most. Because if we don't give them extra love and care and support, then nothing's going to change. We'll always see them as different to us, and they'll always be worse off. They'll always be on the outside. And that's the frustration that we're seeing now in the US and across the world. It feels like nothing is really changing, even though we've been talking about these issues for decades. Because most people in positions of power and privilege aren't shaped by what God says, and they don't want to give special treatment to those who really need it. Before we go off to groups, I want to look at another story from the Bible that Jesus told that shows us God's heart, but also his design for how humanity should treat each other. It starts with a teacher of the law asking Jesus what he has to do to get to heaven. Now, a teacher of the law is supposed to be someone who's an expert in how to follow the laws of the Old Testament. So Jesus puts the question back to him. And the teacher quotes from the Bible and says, you have to love God with all you have and love your neighbor as yourself. But then he asks Jesus, but who is my neighbor? What he was really asking was, who are the people that he has to love? And to answer him, Jesus told a story. A man was traveling along a country road when he was attacked. They beat him up, took everything he had, and left him on the side of the road. Soon after, a priest came along. But he saw the man lying there and crossed to the other side of the road and walked past. Then a temple assistant came along, and he also crossed to the other side of the road and walked past. Finally, a Samaritan came along. Now, Jews hated Samaritans. Samaritans used to be part of the Israelites, but then they had disagreements which led to wars, and then Samaritans had married other races and worshipped other gods. So they were basically enemies with the Jews. And the Jews looked down on them as inferior. But in the story, when the Samaritan saw the Jewish man lying in the ditch, he felt compassion. So he bandaged his wounds and took him to an inn and paid the innkeeper to look after him until he got better. So after telling this story, Jesus asked the teacher who was a neighbor to the man who was attacked. Now, obviously, the teacher answered the person who showed mercy, who was, loving to the man lying in the ditch. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. Now, when we hear stories with a lesson, we try to find ourselves in the story to see what's the lesson for me. So as the story unfolded, the teacher would have been thinking, the priest, he wasn't very nice. I'm not like him. And then the temple assistant was just as bad. I'm not like him either. So you would have been waiting for that third person and thinking, right, that's going to be me. That's going to be the person I can identify with. But when the third person turned out to be a Samaritan, it would have thrown the teacher completely. He would have thought, no matter how good this Samaritan is, I am never going to be like a Samaritan. But if that was the last character in the story, then who can I identify with? The only other character was the person who was robbed. And I think that is one of the points that Jesus was making. The teacher was an important person, asking who the minimum number of people he had to love to get to heaven. And Jesus tells him that instead of looking at the world from a position of power and asking, who do I have to share my privilege with? He gets him to imagine looking at the world from a position of need. When you are lying in a ditch, far from home, you don't care who's supposed to help you, and you aren't going to wait for your next door neighbor to come and help you either. You just want anyone with a heart to help you. And I think we need that same shift in thinking. Elsewhere, Jesus said that it's actually quite easy to love your friends, loving people who are just like you. But loving people who are different to you, who aren't your friends, who you might even be afraid of or even hate, that's much harder. But imagine if there were more people like that in the world, who show love to anyone that needs it. That would make a difference in this world. Okay, we're going to go off to groups now and think about our response to all this. Where is our heart at? What biases might we have? And what can we do about all this?